They say the sky is the ultimate equalizer, but for Captain Richard Hayes, it was a kingdom where he made the rules. When a soft-spoken black woman boarded his multi-million-dollar Gulfstream jet wearing simple sweatpants and speaking with a thick Louisiana drawl, Richard thought he had her figured out. He mocked her voice. He disrespected her presence. He thought she was just a lucky guest on a rich man's dime. He had no idea the woman he was laughing at held the deed to the very plane he was flying and the power to ground him forever. The morning air at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey was crisp, carrying the distinct sharp scent of jet fuel and old money. Teterboro was the undisputed capital of private aviation on the East Coast, a bustling hub where billionaires, celebrities, and corporate titans bypassed the indignities of commercial terminals. Out on the tarmac, gleaming metal birds sat perfectly aligned, their polished fuselages reflecting the pale dawn light. Among them was tail number N 774 VK, a state-of-the-art Gulfstream G650ER. It was a masterpiece of modern engineering, boasting a custom interior of burled walnut cream-colored artisan leather and gold-plated fixtures. In the cockpit sat Captain Richard Hayes. Richard was a veteran of the skies, a 52-year-old pilot with silver-tipped hair, a square jaw, and an ego that could rival the wingspan of a Boeing 747. Having spent the last 15 years flying the world's elite for Apex Aviation, a premier private charter company, Richard had developed a warped sense of superiority. He rubbed shoulders with hedge fund managers and real estate tycoons so often that he had begun to believe he was one of them. He wore his tailored uniform like a military general, his 4 gold stripes, a testament to his perceived absolute authority. To Richard, the passengers were merely cargo that paid for his lavish lifestyle, and he judged them instantly, based on the cut of their suits or the logos on their luggage. On this particular Tuesday, Richard was reviewing the flight manifest for a trip down to Miami. He noticed a single passenger, listed V. Kensington. "Just one today, Thomas," Richard said, leaning back in his leather seat and sipping a black coffee. He glanced at his 28-year-old co-pilot, Thomas Wright, who was diligently running through the pre-flight checklists. "Yes, sir," Thomas replied, his eyes fixed on the digital displays. "Dispatch said she's a VIP, requested absolute privacy." Richard scoffed, setting his coffee down. "They all request privacy, Tommy. Probably some mid-level executive's new girlfriend taking the bird for a shopping trip to Bal Harbour. I've seen it 100 times. They come on board, demand bottomless champagne, and leave a mess." Inside the signature flight support terminal, the reality of V. Kensington was vastly different from Richard's cynical imagination. Valerie Kensington sat quietly in a secluded corner of the VIP lounge, sipping a cup of chamomile tea. At 42, Valerie was a formidable force in the world of global logistics and tech acquisitions. Born and raised in a working-class neighborhood in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, she had built a multi-billion-dollar empire from the ground up. She was brilliant, fiercely independent, and completely uninterested in the flashy displays of wealth that plagued her tax bracket. Today, Valerie was dressed for comfort. She wore a high-end but completely unbranded matching cashmere lounge set in a muted charcoal grey paired with clean white sneakers. Her natural hair was pulled back into an elegant, simple bun. She carried a battered leather briefcase that held more financial leverage than the entire airport combined. What nobody at Apex Aviation knew, not the dispatchers, not the ground crew, and certainly not Captain Richard Hayes, was that Valerie hadn't just chartered this flight. Through a maze of shell companies and a discreet corporate buyout, finalized 48 hours prior, Valerie's holding company had just purchased Apex Aviation in its entirety. This Gulf Stream wasn't just her ride, it was her property. This flight was an unannounced audit. She wanted to see exactly how her new employees operated when they thought the boss wasn't looking. Ms. Kensington. A polite FBO representative approached her. Captain Hayes is ready for you. The vehicle is waiting to take you to the aircraft. Thank you, darling, Valerie replied, her voice carrying the warm, melodic drawl of her Louisiana roots. It was an accent she had never tried to hide, a badge of honor that reminded her of where she came from. Valerie stepped into the black SUV and was driven the short distance to the Gulf Stream. As the car pulled up to the aircraft stairs, the flight attendant, Jessica Bowman, was waiting at the door with a welcoming, practiced smile. Good morning, Miss Kensington. Welcome aboard, Jessica said, taking Valerie's small overnight bag. Morning, Jessica. It's a beautiful day for flying, isn't it? Valerie smiled genuinely, stepping into the cabin. The interior was breathtaking, but Valerie's keen eyes were already taking note of the details. A slight scuff on the wooden bulkhead, a magazine rack that wasn't perfectly aligned. Small things, but in the luxury charter business, perfection was the baseline. Up in the cockpit, Richard heard the boarding. He unbuckled his harness, deciding it was time to make his standard introductory appearance. He expected to see a woman draped in diamonds and designer logos. Instead, he stepped into the cabin and paused, his eyes narrowing as he took in Valerie's casual attire and unassuming demeanor. Valerie looked up, offering a polite nod. Morning, Captain. Richard forced a tight, condescending smile. Welcome aboard. You must be Valerie. I'm Captain Hayes. I'm the man in charge of this aircraft. The emphasis on this aircraft was not lost on Valerie. She recognized the look in his eyes immediately. It was a look she had encountered 1,000 times in corporate boardrooms before she made her first billion. It was the look of a man who had already assessed her net worth, her background, and her importance, and found them all severely lacking. Pleasure to meet you, Captain, Valerie said smoothly, taking her seat in one of the plush captain's chairs. Richard didn't offer his hand. Instead, he gave her a curt nod. We'll be wheels up in 10 minutes. Try not to adjust the climate controls too much. The system is sensitive. If you need a drink, Jessica will handle it. With that, he turned on his heel and strode back into the cockpit, closing the door a little harder than necessary. Valerie watched him go, a faint, knowing smile playing on her lips. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a legal pad and a silver pen. The audit had officially begun. The cabin was silent, save for the hum of the auxiliary power unit. Valerie settled into the hand-stitched leather seat, feeling the subtle vibrations of the massive Rolls-Royce engines spooling up. She pulled her phone from her pocket and dialed her lead acquisitions attorney David Caldwell to confirm the final wire transfers for the Apex Aviation buyout. David, it's Val, she said, as the call connected. Her voice relaxed and unguarded, leaned heavily into her southern cadence. Yeah, I'm on the bird now. Listen, I need you to triple-check those escrow accounts. I don't want a single dime out of place before we make the public announcement on Thursday. Up front, Richard had stepped out of the cockpit one last time to grab a flight plan printout from the galley printer. He paused behind the cabin divider, out of Valerie's sight, but well within earshot. He listened to her speak. No sugar that ain't gonna work, Valerie was saying to her lawyer, completely unaware of her audience. Tell them if they want to play hardball with the maintenance records, we'll strip the executive board of their golden parachutes. I ain't playing games with these folks. You get it sorted here. Richard rolled his eyes, a smirk, twisting his features. He looked over at Jessica, who was quietly prepping a fruit platter in the tiny galley. Get a load of this one, Richard whispered to Jessica, his tone dripping with venomous amusement. Sounds like she just rolled out of a swamp. I ain't playing games, he mimicked, heavily exaggerating Valerie's drawl, turning it into a cartoonish caricature. Who booked this flight? Did she win the lottery or something? She doesn't belong on a G65. Oh, she belongs on a Greyhound bus. Jessica stiffened her eyes, widening in panic. "Captain, please keep your voice down," she hissed, glancing nervously toward the cabin divider. "Relax, Jess. These new money lottery types, they don't know the difference between a Gulf Stream and a crop duster." Richard scoffed, turning around. "Just keep the cheap champagne flowing and make sure she doesn't wipe her greasy hands on the upholstery." Richard didn't realize how acoustics worked in the meticulously engineered cabin of a G650ER. The curved ceiling was designed to bounce sound in specific ways, and right now it carried his hushed, mocking whispers directly to the rear of the cabin. Valerie went perfectly still. The voice of her attorney buzzed in her ear, but she wasn't listening anymore. The pen in her hand hovered over her legal pad. She had faced racism and classism throughout her entire career. She had been underestimated, spoken over, and dismissed by men in expensive suits more times than she could count. But there was something uniquely vile about hearing it from a man whose paycheck she was currently signing. "David," Valerie said softly into the phone, her tone dropping 10 degrees. "Hold everything. Don't finalize the executive retention packages yet. We might be making some immediate personnel changes." She ended the call and slipped the phone into her pocket. The anger simmering in her chest was cold and calculating. Valerie wasn't one to throw a tantrum. She didn't scream and she didn't cry. She destroyed her enemies systematically. A moment later, Richard stepped around the divider, the fake customer service smile plastered back on his face. "Everything to your liking, Valerie?" he asked, not bothering to use Ms. Kensington. Valerie looked up at him. Her eyes were dark and unreadable. "It's quite comfortable, Captain. Though I did notice a bit of a draft. Could we adjust the temperature?" Richard sighed, an audible theatrical sound of inconvenience. "Like I said earlier, the system is delicate. It takes time to balance the avionics cooling with the cabin heat. It's complicated engineering. I'll see what I can do, but you'll just have to put on a sweater for now." "Complicated engineering," Valerie repeated slowly. "I see. I suppose balancing the bleed air from the engines to the environmental control system is quite the task." Richard blinked momentarily, thrown off by her accurate use of aviation terminology. He quickly recovered his arrogance, shielding him from the warning signs. "Exactly. Glad you understand. Now sit back and enjoy the ride. We've got a slot in the departure queue, and I don't want to miss it because I'm playing thermostat monitor." He turned and walked back to the cockpit. Jessica emerged from the galley a moment later, looking flushed and intensely uncomfortable. She approached Valerie with a silver tray, holding a crystal glass of sparkling water. "Miss Kensington, I apologize if the cabin is too cold. I can bring you a cashmere blanket if you'd like." Jessica offered her voice, trembling slightly. Valerie looked at the young woman. She could tell Jessica had heard the captain's remarks and was deeply embarrassed by them. "That would be lovely, Jessica. Thank you. And please don't worry about the temperature. I have a feeling things are going to heat up very soon." Jessica nodded, handing over the water. "Captain Hayes can be a bit rough around the edges. He's been flying a long time." "Longevity does not excuse insolence," Valerie said quietly. She took a sip of the water. "Tell me, Jessica, does the captain often speak about his passengers that way?" Jessica froze, caught between loyalty to her crew and the intimidating presence of the woman before her. I really couldn't say, ma'am. I just serve the food." "A diplomatic answer," Valerie noted, jotting something down on her legal pad. "Don't worry, Jessica. Your professionalism is noted." As Jessica retreated to the galley, the aircraft lurched forward. The twin engines roared to life, pushing the heavy jet down the taxiway. Valerie looked out the window as the sprawling concrete of Teterboro blurred past. The plane banked onto the runway, paused for a fraction of a second, and then unleashed its massive thrust. The G650ER pinned Valerie back against the leather seat as it rocketed into the New Jersey sky, climbing at a steep, aggressive angle. Up in the cockpit, Richard was in his element. He manhandled the yoke, treating the luxury jet like a fighter plane. He loved the power, the control. He loved looking down at the world below, knowing he was above it all. "Flaps up," Richard commanded. "Flaps up," Thomas confirmed. "Passing 10,000 feet. Smooth climb." "Keep her steady, Tommy," Richard said, engaging the autopilot. He unclasped his heavy headset and draped it over the console. "I'm going to go check on our VIP. Make sure she hasn't started a bonfire in the cabin." Thomas frowned. "Captain, she seems perfectly nice," and dispatch flagged her as a high net worth individual. "Maybe we should treat her with a bit more." "More what, Tommy?" "Respect," Richard laughed sharply. "Money doesn't buy class. You heard her talking. She sounds like she belongs on a riverboat, not a Gulf Stream. These people get a little bit of cash and think they own the world. It's my job to remind them whose sky this is." Richard adjusted his tie, smoothed his uniform jacket, and opened the cockpit door, completely oblivious to the fact that he was walking straight into a trap entirely of his own making. The Gulf Stream leveled out at a cruising altitude of 41,000 feet, slicing through the thin, frigid air high above the East Coast clouds. The cabin was a sanctuary of silence, the acoustic insulation working flawlessly. Valerie sat with her laptop open, reviewing a dossier on Apex Aviation's operational costs. The numbers were sloppy, fuel expenditures were too high, maintenance logs were delayed, and the pilot payroll was heavily inflated by excessive per diem bonuses that Captain Hayes seemed to approve for himself with alarming frequency. Richard strolled out of the cockpit, exuding a swagger that bordered on comical. He paused by Jessica in the galley. "Is she asleep?" he asked loudly, not caring if his voice carried. "She's working, Captain," Jessica whispered, her eyes pleading with him to be professional. Richard scoffed and walked down the aisle, stopping right next to Valerie's seat. He leaned heavily against the wooden bulkhead, crossing his arms. "Everything going all right back here, Val?" he asked. The use of her shortened first name, uninvited, was a deliberate microaggression. Valerie didn't immediately look up from her screen. She let him stand there for 5 agonizingly long seconds, forcing him to wait on her. Finally, she closed the laptop with a soft click and met his gaze. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and completely devoid of warmth. "The flight is smooth, Captain Hayes," she said, her accent present, but her enunciation razor-sharp. "Though I am curious about your flight path. We seem to be tracking further east over the Atlantic than the standard routing to Miami dictates. Are we dodging a weather system, or just burning extra fuel?" Richard's smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second. The standard route was indeed more direct, but he preferred the coastal route because it allowed him to log slightly more flight time, padding his lucrative hourly bonus. He had never had a passenger question his routing before. Most of them didn't even know what a flight path was. "We route according to air traffic control vectors and upper-level wind patterns," Richard said, his tone instantly turning defensive and patronizing. "It's highly technical. Nothing you need to worry your head about. The owner of this company pays for the fuel, not you." Valerie tilted her head. "The owner. And who might that be?" "Apex Elite is owned by a private consortium," Richard boasted, puffing out his chest. "Billionaires, real titans of industry, people who demand the best, which is why they employ me. In fact, we're expecting the new majority shareholder to do a fleet inspection later this week. I'll be flying them personally." Is that so? Valerie asked, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. You must be highly valued by the company. I am the company, Richard stated arrogantly. Pilots like me are the reason people pay 40 grand a flight. We provide the safety, the discretion, and the class. Class, Valerie repeated. She picked up her pen. Tell me, Captain Hayes, does class include mocking a passenger's dialect outside the galley, or deliberately ignoring cabin temperature requests, or perhaps padding your flight route to extract more hourly pay from your employer? The air in the cabin seemed to freeze. Richard's face went rigid. The color drained from his cheeks, only to be replaced by a hot, furious red. Excuse me. He snapped his voice, dropping its faux polite veneer. I don't know who you think you are, lady, but you don't talk to me like that on my airplane. I am the pilot in command. My authority is absolute. Your authority extends to the safe operation of this aircraft, Captain, Valerie corrected him smoothly. It does not grant you the right to be a bigot, nor does it make you immune to accountability. Richard leaned closer, trying to use his physical size to intimidate her. Listen here. I don't care who bought your ticket. You're a guest, and if you have a problem with how I run things, you can take it up with customer service when we land. But until then, you keep your mouth shut and let me do my job. Jessica, who had been watching in horror from the galley, took a step forward. Captain, please, stay out of this, Jess. Richard barked, not breaking eye contact with Valerie. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You give some people a taste of luxury, and they forget their place. Valerie didn't flinch. She didn't shrink back. She simply reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder. She placed it deliberately on the mahogany table in front of her. My place, Valerie said softly. The Louisiana drawl vanished, completely replaced by the chilling, precise tone of a corporate executioner. Let's talk about my place, Captain Hayes. She flipped open the folder. On the very top was a legal document bearing the seal of the state of Delaware. The header read, Articles of Acquisition, Apex Aviation, Elite LLC. Do you know what a leveraged buyout is? Richard, Valerie asked. She didn't wait for him to answer. It's a financial transaction where a company is purchased using a significant amount of borrowed money to meet the cost of acquisition. But I don't like debt. So when I bought Apex Aviation 48 hours ago, I paid in cash. Richard stared at the document. His brain struggled to process the words on the page. His eyes darted from the paper to Valerie's calm, unyielding face. That's impossible. Richard stammered, his bravado evaporating like mist. The new owner is a holding group out of New York, Kensington Global. Kensington Global, Valerie nodded. And what is my name? Captain. Richard's mouth opened and closed. V. Kensington. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The woman in the sweatpants, the woman with the accent, the woman he had just told to keep her mouth shut on his airplane. Valerie tapped a manicured fingernail against the legal document. This jet is not yours, Richard. It is mine. The seat you are sitting in, the uniform you are wearing, the fuel you are needlessly burning, it all belongs to me. Richard stumbled back a step, literally retreating. Ms. Kensington. I didn't realize. I was just joking earlier. It's a high-stress job, and sometimes we use dark humor to... Do not insult my intelligence by calling your prejudice a joke. Valerie interrupted, her voice ringing like a steel bell in the quiet cabin. You looked at me and made an assumption based on my race, my gender, and my voice. You decided I was beneath you. You decided I was unworthy of respect. Ma'am, please. Richard pleaded, the arrogance entirely stripped away, leaving only a desperate aging man terrified of losing his 6-figure salary. I have 20 years of exemplary service. My record is flawless. I can be a valuable asset to your team. Valerie shook her head slowly. A man who cannot respect his passengers cannot be trusted with their lives. Your technical skills are irrelevant if your character is compromised. She looked past him to the flight attendant. Jessica. Jessica snapped to attention. Yes, Miss Kensington. Please inform the co-pilot, Mr. Wright, that he is now the acting pilot in command. Have him contact Miami Air Traffic Control and request priority routing. I want to be on the ground as quickly as possible. Yes, ma'am, Jessica said, hurrying toward the cockpit. Richard looked completely broken. You're firing me up here. You can't do that. I am not firing you up here, Valerie said, closing the folder. I am relieving you of your duties. You will return to the cockpit, sit in the jump seat, and not touch a single control for the remainder of this flight. When we land in Miami, security will be waiting to escort you off my property. Your termination papers will be finalized before the engines are cool. Richard stood paralyzed, the weight of his own hubris crushing him. He looked at the luxurious cabin he had ruled for years, suddenly realizing it was no longer his kingdom. It was his courtroom, and the judge had just handed down her sentence. Defeated, humiliated, and silent, Captain Richard Hayes turned and walked back to the cockpit, a king exiled from his own sky. Valerie watched him go, took a sip of her sparkling water, and opened her laptop once more. The audit was complete. It was time to clean house. The transition of power at 41,000 feet was as silent as it was absolute. Inside the state-of-the-art cockpit of the Gulfstream G650ER, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Thomas Wright, the 28-year-old co-pilot, sat rigid in the right seat. His hands hovered over the yoke, his eyes locked onto the primary flight display. He had spent years logging hours studying aerodynamics and enduring Captain Richard Hayes's endless barrage of condescension, waiting for his chance to command a jet of this caliber. He just never imagined the promotion would happen mid-flight, mandated by a billionaire passenger who had just legally decapitated his boss. The cockpit door unlatched, and Richard stepped inside. The older man looked physically diminished. The military-esque posture that had defined him on the Teterboro tarmac had evaporated. He didn't say a word. He simply pulled down the fold-away jump seat, a cramped, unpadded fold-out chair situated behind the central pedestal, typically reserved for FAA inspectors or check airmen. As he strapped himself into the 5-point harness, his hands trembled. "Captain, I mean Richard," Thomas started, his voice tight. "I have the flight controls. Just fly the damn plane." "Tommy!" Richard spat, his voice a hoarse whisper. He stared a hole into the back of Thomas's head, his mind spinning frantically. This couldn't be happening. He was an apex predator of the aviation world. He had flown CEOs of Fortune 500 companies to Davos. He had ferried royalty to the Maldives. To be benched by a woman in sweatpants because of a few whispered jokes. It was an outrage. It was unfair. Miami Center, Gulfstream, November 774 Victor Kilo. Thomas said into his headset, keying the mic with a steady thumb, "Requesting direct routing to Miami International descend and maintain flight level 300. We have a VIP request for expedited arrival." Static crackled briefly before the air traffic controller responded. "Gulfstream 4 Victor Kilo Miami Center. Cleared direct Miami International. Descend and maintain flight level 300. Expect vectors for the ILS runway 9er approach." "Cleared direct descending to 300 for Victor Kilo. Thomas confirmed. He smoothly dialed back the auto-throttle and adjusted the pitch. The massive jet began a graceful, perfectly executed descent. Back in the cabin, the tension had morphed into a quiet, electric productivity. Valerie Kensington had completely dismissed Richard from her mind. To her, he was no longer a threat. He was merely a logistical error that had been corrected. She was back on the phone with David Caldwell, her lead attorney. "David, I want a full sweep of the HR records at Apex." Valerie instructed, her voice calm and authoritative. If Captain Hayes felt comfortable speaking that way in front of a junior flight attendant, it's a systemic issue. It's institutional rot. Pull the files on every pilot complaint filed in the last 5 years. I want to know who looked the other way. "You got it, Val," David replied through the encrypted line. "We have the transition team ready at the Signature Flight Support Terminal in Miami. The moment you land, the new corporate structure goes into effect. Have you decided what to do with the current executive board? Severance packages for the ones who cooperate, litigation for the ones who don't," Valerie said simply. "I'm cleaning house." Jessica Bowman stood in the galley, watching Valerie with a mixture of awe and profound relief. For 2 years, Jessica had endured Richard's toxic behavior. She had smiled through his inappropriate comments, apologized for his outbursts, and lived in constant fear of his evaluations, which dictated her flight assignments. Seeing him stripped of his power was like watching a tyrant fall. Valerie ended her call and looked over at the young flight attendant. "Jessica, you can breathe, darling. He's not going to hurt you." Jessica let out a breath she felt she had been holding since New Jersey. "Miss Kensington, I don't know what to say. I've never seen anyone stand up to him. He practically ran the charter division. Bullies only run things until someone with a bigger stick comes along," Valerie said softly, gesturing for Jessica to take the seat across from her. "Sit down for a moment." Jessica hesitated, then carefully sat on the edge of the cream-colored leather chair. "You handled yourself with grace today," Valerie told her, looking her directly in the eye. "You tried to de-escalate a situation created by a superior who abused his rank. That takes courage." "I just wanted to do my job," Jessica whispered. "I love flying, but the culture here, it's been difficult." "I know," Valerie nodded. "That changes today. When we land, I'll be appointing a new director of in-flight services for Apex Elite. I need someone who understands the frontline experience, someone who values respect over ego. I'd like you to submit your resume to my transition team this afternoon." Jessica's eyes widened, filling with sudden, unexpected tears. Are you serious, Miss Kensington? I'm just a junior attendant." "You're a professional who kept your composure while your captain lost his mind," Valerie corrected. "I hire for character, Jessica. Skills can be taught. Integrity cannot. Think about it. Up in the cockpit, the situation was deteriorating. Richard, unable to accept his sudden irrelevance, began to back-seat drive. "You're descending too fast, Tommy," Richard hissed from the jump seat, leaning forward to look at the altimeter. "You're going to overspeed the airframe. Pull back the speed brakes." Thomas kept his eyes forward. "Speed is within limits, Captain. Airspeed is 280 knots. We are perfectly on the glide slope." "Don't talk back to me," Richard snapped, his voice trembling with panicked rage. "I have over 10,000 hours in this specific jet. You're going to make a hard landing, and she's going to blame me. Put the speed brakes out." "Negative," Thomas said, his voice dropping an octave, finding a spine he didn't know he had. "If I deploy the speed brakes now, the vibration will spill her drink in the back. I'm flying the airplane, Richard. Sit back and stay off the comms." Richard fell silent, his face turning an unhealthy shade of purple. He realized with a crushing finality that he had no leverage left. He reached into his breast pocket and discreetly pulled out his smartphone. Shielding the screen with his hand, he desperately texted the chief pilot at Apex Aviation's headquarters, hoping to spin the narrative before they landed. Text to Chief Pilot Miller. Need immediate union rep at MIA. Crazy passenger hijacked my authority, claiming she bought the company. Grounding the flight. Hostile environment. He hit send, hoping his old boys club network would save him. He didn't know that Chief Pilot Miller was currently sitting in a conference room in New York, surrounded by Valerie's corporate auditors, boxing up his own desk. The skies over South Florida were a brilliant, piercing blue. The Gulf Stream banked gently over Biscayne Bay, the turquoise water glittering far below. The sprawling metropolis of Miami stretched out toward the Everglades, a concrete jungle bordered by tropical paradise. As they lined up with the runway at Miami International Airport, the landing gear deployed with a heavy, reassuring thud. Gear down 3 green, Thomas announced to the empty left seat, sticking strictly to protocol. Flaps full, cleared to land runway 9er. The G650ER glided over the perimeter fence of MIA and touched down on the sun-baked asphalt with barely a shudder. It was a textbook landing, smooth-centered and perfectly executed. Thomas engaged the thrust reversers, the engines roaring as they slowed the massive aircraft. "Welcome to Miami, Miss Kensington," Thomas said over the PA system, his voice steady and professional. "Local time is 11:45 a.m. It has been an absolute honor flying you today." In the back, Valerie smiled and closed her laptop. Thomas taxied the jet away from the commercial terminals, navigating the complex web of taxiways toward the private aviation sector. As they approached the Signature Flight Support FBO, the scene on the ramp was highly unusual. Normally, a single line attendant with a pair of orange wands would be waiting to guide them in. Today there was a veritable welcoming committee. 2 sleek black Cadillac Escalades were parked adjacent to the painted parking box. Standing beside them were 4 individuals in dark suits, Valerie's Miami legal and security team. Flanking them were 2 uniformed Miami-Dade airport police officers, standing by with professional indifference. Inside the cockpit, Richard peered through the windshield and felt his stomach drop into his designer shoes. "What is this?" he muttered. "Tommy, who called the cops." "I don't know, Richard," Thomas replied, shutting down the massive Rolls-Royce engines. "But I have a feeling they aren't here for the baggage." Thomas completed the shutdown checklist and unbuckled his harness. He opened the cockpit door and stepped out, deliberately blocking Richard from entering the cabin first. Jessica had already lowered the main air stair door, letting the thick, humid Florida air flood into the cool, climate-controlled cabin. Valerie stood up, smoothing the front of her lounge set. She picked up her battered leather briefcase. "Excellent landing, Thomas," she said, as she approached the front. "Smooth as glass." "Thank you, Miss Kensington." Thomas nodded respectfully. "It was a pleasure." Valerie descended the air stairs. As her white sneakers hit the tarmac, the lead suit, a sharp-looking man named Marcus Thorne, head of Kensington Global Security, stepped forward. "Good morning, Miss Kensington. The transition is complete. All escrow accounts have cleared, and the board has been legally notified," Marcus said, handing her a digital tablet. "Perfect timing, Marcus," Valerie said, signing the screen with a stylus. "Now we have a bit of housekeeping to take care of." Back on the plane, Richard shoved past Thomas and practically sprinted down the stairs. He hit the tarmac, his face red, his uniform jacket flapping in the warm breeze. He saw the police. He saw the suits, and his survival instincts kicked in. He decided to play the only card he thought he had left authority. "Arthur!" Richard yelled, spotting the general manager of the FBO, Arthur Pendleton, standing near the terminal doors. Arthur, get over here. This passenger is unhinged. She interfered with flight operations, threatened my crew, and is making terroristic claims about owning the airline. Arthur, a seasoned FBO manager who catered to billionaires daily, didn't move a muscle. He simply looked at Richard with a mixture of pity and second-hand embarrassment. Richard marched toward Valerie, pointing an accusing finger. Officers, I want her detained. I am the captain of this aircraft, and she is a threat to aviation security. The two police officers didn't flinch. They looked to Marcus, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod. Valerie turned slowly to face Richard. The brilliant Miami sun reflected off the polished silver of the Gulf Stream behind her, framing her like a monument. Captain Hayes. Valerie said, her voice easily cutting through the ambient noise of the airport. You seem to be confused about jurisdiction. Let me clarify. She took a step closer to him. You are standing on a ramp leased by Apex Aviation. You are standing next to an aircraft owned by Apex Aviation. And as of 9 a.m. this morning, I am the sole proprietor of Apex Aviation. Richard's finger slowly lowered. No. The union. Your union representative was briefed 20 minutes ago, Marcus interjected, smoothly stepping between Valerie and the disgraced pilot. Given the multiple recorded violations of company policy insubordination and creating a hostile work environment, the union has declined to contest your immediate termination for cause. Richard gasped, physically staggering backward. For cause, You can't terminate me for cause. I lose my pension, I lose my stock options. You lost those the moment you decided my accent made me less of a human being. Valerie stated, her eyes locking onto his with terrifying intensity. You built your entire identity around the metal you fly and the money of the people who sit in the back. You thought you were untouchable. But true power, Richard, doesn't need to wear 4 gold stripes or mock the people below it. She extended an open hand. Your company ID, your access keys, your corporate credit card. Hand them over. Richard stood frozen on the baking tarmac. He looked at Thomas, who was standing at the top of the air stairs, watching silently. He looked at Jessica, who stood beside Thomas, her chin held high. He looked at the FBO manager, who had already turned his back. There was no one left to save him. The empire he thought he ruled was a mirage. With trembling hands, Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out his heavy keychain. He unclipped his security badge from his belt. He slowly handed them to Marcus. Ms. Kensington, Richard whispered, the arrogance entirely hollowed out, leaving a pathetic shell. I'm 52 years old. Nobody hires a commercial pilot fired for cause at my age. This will ruin me. Valerie looked at him, her expression devoid of sympathy. Then perhaps you should have considered the cost of your arrogance before you opened your mouth. Actions have consequences, Richard. Yours have finally arrived. She turned away from him and looked at the 2 police officers. Gentleman, Mr. Hayes is officially a trespasser on private company property. Please escort him off the airport premises. He can find his own way home. Yes, ma'am, one of the officers said, stepping forward and firmly grasping Richard by the elbow. Let's go, buddy. Time to walk. As the police led the stumbling, broken pilot away toward the perimeter gate, Valerie turned back to her new jet. Thomas and Jessica were still standing at the top of the stairs. Thomas, Jessica, Valerie called out. Take the plane to the hangar. Take the rest of the week off, fully paid. We have a lot of restructuring to do, and I'll need you both fresh for the new era of this company. Yes, boss. Thomas smiled widely. Valerie turned and walked toward the waiting Escalade. The audit was over. The trash had been taken out. It was a beautiful day in Miami, and she had an airline to run. The Miami heat was unforgiving, but it was nothing compared to the cold reality settling into Richard Hayes's bones. Left outside the perimeter fence of Miami International Airport, dragging his heavy leather flight bag along the cracked sidewalk of the public access road, Richard looked nothing like the untouchable aviator he had been just 2 hours prior. His tailored uniform jacket felt like a straitjacket in the humid Florida air. He pulled out his phone, his hand slick with sweat, and dialed the private number of Arthur Harrington, a billionaire hedge fund manager he had flown exclusively to St. Bart's for the past 4 years. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. Richard dialed again. This time Arthur answered, his tone unusually clipped. "Richard, now is not a good time," Arthur said sharply. "Arthur, listen to me. You have to help me." Richard pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. "That new owner, Kensington, she's out of her mind. She terminated me on the tarmac. You have leverage. You charter 100 hours a month with Apex. Tell her you'll pull your contracts if she doesn't reinstate me." A heavy sigh echoed through the receiver. "Richard, are you insane?" Valerie Kensington didn't just buy Apex Aviation. Her holding company just acquired a 30% stake in my firm's primary logistics provider. "I'm not jeopardizing a billion-dollar supply chain because you couldn't keep your prejudices in check." Frankly, she sent over the flight transcript and the crew affidavits. "You're radioactive, Richard. Do not call this number again." The line went dead. Richard stared at the screen, the weight of his isolation crashing down on him. The old boys' club he thought he belonged to didn't actually exist. They only tolerated him because he held the keys to their flying limousines. Without the jet, he was just another unemployed liability. He opened his banking app to buy a commercial first-class ticket back to New York. A red error message flashed across the screen. "Account frozen. Pending legal review." Panic seized his chest. He tried his corporate Amex. Declined. He tried a secondary credit card. Declined. Back inside the air-conditioned sanctuary of the Apex Aviation Miami boardroom, Valerie Kensington sat at the head of a long mahogany table. Across from her sat David Caldwell, her lead attorney, surrounded by stacks of financial ledgers and maintenance logs. The true depth of Richard's arrogance was finally coming to light, and it extended far beyond his foul mouth. "You called it Val," David said, sliding a thick manila folder across the table. He wasn't just inflating his routing times to pad his hourly wages. Captain Hayes was running a sophisticated kickback scheme with a third-party maintenance facility in Teterboro. He would ground the aircraft for emergency avionics repairs, authorize the invoices himself, and split the inflated costs with the shop owner. "We estimate he's embezzled close to $400,000 over the last 3 years. Valerie didn't show a flicker of surprise. Arrogance and entitlement usually go hand in hand with theft, she noted quietly. He thought the company's money was his money because he believed he was the only reason the company operated. "How do you want to proceed?" David asked, his pen poised. "We have enough to bury him in civil litigation, but this crosses the threshold into federal wire fraud." "Give the files to the FBI," Valerie said without hesitation. "I don't cover up crimes to protect a brand's image. And David makes sure every penny he stole is calculated into a restitution order. I want his pensions liquidated to pay back the crew members he systemically short-changed on their per diems. He thought they were beneath him. Let's see how he feels funding their retirement." While Valerie dismantled the corrupt infrastructure of her new company, Richard was facing the ultimate indignity. Out of options and out of cash, he had walked 3 miles to a local pawn shop where he traded his gold-plated aviator watch for enough cash to buy a one-way ticket back to New Jersey. Not on a commercial flight, and certainly not in first class. At 6 p.m., Richard Hayes, the former king of the Teterboro tarmac, boarded a Greyhound bus. He shuffled down the narrow, dimly lit aisle, the smell of stale diesel and cheap fast food turning his stomach. He squeezed his broad shoulders into a rigid, sticky seat near the back, right next to the lavatory. As the bus lurched onto the interstate for the agonizing 22-hour drive, north, Richard stared out the grease-smudged window. He looked up at the sky, watching the faint, white contrail of a high-altitude jet slicing through the twilight, knowing with absolute certainty that he would never touch the clouds again. 6 months later, the atmosphere at Teterboro Airport was unrecognizable. The toxic, fear-driven culture that had once permeated the Apex Aviation hangars had been entirely eradicated. The aircraft were the same. The leather seats were just as plush, but the people operating them moved with a newfound sense of pride and dignity. In the signature FBO terminal, Jessica Bowman stood in front of a small group of new flight attendant recruits. She wore a sharp, modern navy blue blazer with the new Kensington Elite logo pinned to the lapel. As the newly appointed Director of In-Flight Services, Jessica had completely rewritten the crew manual. Luxury is not an excuse for abuse. Jessica told the recruits, her voice projecting confidence and warmth. In this company, we provide world-class service to our clients, but we demand world-class respect in return. If a passenger or a pilot ever crosses the line, you do not smile and endure it. You report it. You are the safety officers of the cabin, and management has your back. Out on the tarmac Gulf Stream, N774 VK gleamed in the morning sun. The air stairs were down, and standing at the top, greeting the ground crew, was Captain Thomas Wright. The 4 gold stripes on his shoulders were hard-earned. Under Valerie's new leadership promotions were based on skill safety records and psychological evaluations, not seniority or backroom handshakes. Thomas had excelled in all of them. He commanded the jet with quiet confidence, entirely stripping away the ego that had poisoned the left seat for so long. A black SUV pulled up to the aircraft, and Valerie Kensington stepped out. She was dressed in a sharp, tailored burgundy pantsuit, today heading to a major tech acquisition meeting in London. "Good morning, Captain Wright." Valerie smiled as she reached the top of the stairs. "Morning, boss." Thomas beamed. "We've got a smooth route charted across the Atlantic today. Weather is clear all the way to Heathrow. Cabin is prepped exactly to your liking." "I have no doubt," Valerie said, stepping into the cabin. The environment was flawless. The air was fresh, the temperature was perfectly balanced, and there wasn't a hint of tension in the air. It was exactly how a multi-million-dollar operation was supposed to run. Thousands of miles away, in the rural outskirts of upstate New York, the aviation world looked very different. The small, weathered municipal airstrip smelled of cut grass and old engine oil. There were no Gulf Streams here, no billionaires, no luxury SUVs, just a handful of rusting Cessnas and crop dusters. Richard Hayes stood on the cracked asphalt, wearing a faded, grease-stained jumpsuit. The FBI investigation had stripped him of everything. To avoid a lengthy prison sentence, he had agreed to a plea deal that required him to pay full restitution. His accounts were drained, his luxury condo was sold, and his commercial pilot's license was permanently revoked by the FAA due to the fraud convictions. Now he was working as a junior mechanic's assistant at a crop dusting outfit that barely paid minimum wage. "Hey, Hayes!" barked a gruff, sunburned man from the hangar. "Stop daydreaming. The number 4 Cessna needs its oil pan scrubbed, and the lavatory bucket needs emptying. Move it." "Yes, sir. Right away," Richard mumbled, keeping his head down. He grabbed a dirty rag and a heavy plastic bucket, his joints aching from the physical labor he had never been accustomed to. As he walked toward the dilapidated single-engine plane, A deep, resonant roar echoed from the sky above. Richard paused and looked up. High above the clouds, a massive silver jet was carving a perfectly straight contrail across the brilliant blue canvas. Even from 40,000 feet down, Richard could recognize the swept wings and the unmistakable silhouette of a Gulfstream G650. He stood there, gripping his dirty bucket, watching the jet soar higher and faster than he could ever reach again. He thought about the leather seats. He thought about the crisp, cool air of the cockpit. He thought about the woman in the sweatpants he had dismissed as a nobody, realizing too late that true wealth isn't measured by how loudly you announce your presence, but by the power you hold when you decide to speak. Richard lowered his head, the deafening roar of the jet fading into the distance, and went back to scrubbing the oil pan. Up in the stratosphere, Valerie Kensington sipped her chamomile tea completely at peace as her jet chased the horizon toward a new dawn. They say karma flies first class, and in the case of Captain Richard Hayes, it certainly delivered a turbulent landing. What started as a smug display of prejudice and ego ended in a total nosedive, proving that true power doesn't need to shout, and it definitely doesn't judge a book by its cover. If you loved watching this billionaire boss perfectly dismantle a workplace bully at 40,000 feet, don't keep this story grounded. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a brilliant plot twist, and subscribe for more incredible real-life stories of ultimate justice.